Chapter 1: The Golden Years. The cake had 160 candles, each flame dancing like a tiny star against the twilight sky. Dr. Aris Thorne watched from the garden's edge, as her great-great-grandmother Lydia bent forward, her silver hair catching the light, and drew in a breath that would have been impossible for someone her age just a century ago. The candles flickered and died in waves, extinguished by lungs that had been breathing for almost 2 centuries. The gathered family erupted in gentle applause. 5 generations stood together on the terraced lawn of the family estate overlooking Lake Geneva, their ages spanning from Aris's 8-year-old grandnephew Marcus to Lydia herself. The scene would have been impossible in the old world, the world before Khronos. Now, it was simply Tuesday evening in the year 2147. "Make a wish, great-great-nana," Marcus called out, his voice bright with the particular joy that only children possess. At 8, he was the youngest person present, but he would likely see 3 centuries if the projections held true. Lydia's eyes, still sharp and clear despite their age, found Aris across the gathering. There was something in that gaze, a flicker of concern that seemed oddly placed in this moment of celebration. "I wished for discernment," Lydia said, her voice carrying easily across the garden despite her years. "That we might better understand what we have become." Aris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. As a bio-gerontologist specializing in the superelderly, those rare individuals who had pushed past the 150-year mark, she had been hearing whispers lately. Anomalies in the data, patterns that didn't quite fit the standard models of Khronos treatment. But this was neither the time nor place for such thoughts. "Understanding is overrated," laughed Uncle Matthias, who at 97 was considered middle-aged by current standards. "Some mysteries are better left unsolved." "Perhaps," Lydia replied, but her eyes remained on Aris. "Or perhaps some mysteries solve themselves, whether we want them to or not." The party continued around them with the unhurried pace that had become characteristic of their extended civilization. Conversations meandered through decades of shared memory. Children played games with grandparents who remembered the old world, while great-grandparents shared stories with descendants they had never dreamed they would live to see. There was no rush, no urgency. Time, once humanity's greatest enemy, had been conquered along with cancer, disease. Aris found herself gravitating toward the older members of the gathering, as she always did. Professional habit, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. She studied their faces, their movements, their interactions with an eye trained to notice the subtle changes that accumulated across extended lifespans. Most people stopped looking closely at the elderly once Khronos had eliminated the visible markers of decay and disease. But Aris looked closer. "You're working," observed her Aunt Elena, now in her 2nd century. "I can see it in the way you're watching everyone." "Can't help myself," Aris admitted. "Occupational hazard." "And what do you see?" Aris hesitated. What did she see? Uncle Castor, at 142, had developed an almost preternatural ability to sense the moods of everyone around him, responding to emotional currents with a sensitivity that bordered on telepathic. Great Aunt Vera. 134, had begun speaking in a peculiar rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the natural sounds around her, the rustle of leaves, the lap of water against the shore, the distant hum of evening insects. These changes were subtle, beautiful even, but they were changes nonetheless. I see a family that has been blessed by one of the greatest medical advances in human history, she said finally. It was the truth, if not the complete truth. Elena smiled, but there was something knowing in her expression. The official answer. How very scientific of you, niece. As the evening progressed, Aris found herself drawn into conversations that would have been impossible in any previous generation. Her great-great-grandmother spoke of watching the first Khronos trials, of the desperate hope that had driven their adoption, of the slow realization that humanity had fundamentally changed its relationship with time itself. Uncle Castor described the political transformations that had followed, how democracy had evolved when representatives could serve for decades without fear of age-related decline, how long-term thinking had replaced the short-sighted policies of the past. We solved war, you know, he said, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. Not through force or ideology, but through patience. When your political opponents might outlive you by a century, you learn to find common ground. The wisdom of extended time, Lydia added. Though I sometimes wonder if wisdom is the right word for what we've gained. What would you call it then? Aris asked, genuinely curious. Perspective, perhaps. Or maybe just weariness dressed up as enlightenment. As the evening wound down and family members began their leisurely departures, some to homes across the valley, others to different continents or even off-world colonies, Aris lingered with her great-great-grandmother on the terrace. The lake below reflected the lights of settlements that glowed with the steady illumination of a world that no longer rushed toward anything. You're troubled, Lydia observed. I can see it in your shoulders, the way you hold your head. It's the same posture your great-great-grandfather had when he was working through a difficult problem. Aris considered her response carefully. I've been seeing some unusual cases lately. Nothing alarming, just unexpected variations in the super-elderly population. Unexpected how? Physiological adaptations that don't fit the standard Khronos model. Behavioral changes that seem to cluster around certain age groups. It's probably nothing, statistical noise in a small sample size. Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant lights. You know, I remember when they first announced that Khronos would be mandatory for newborns. There was some opposition, of course. People worried about unknown consequences, about playing God with human evolution. She turned to look at her descendant. Perhaps they weren't entirely wrong to worry. The vaccine saved billions of lives, Aris said, reciting the fundamental truth that had shaped their world. Cancer rates dropped to nearly zero within a generation. Human lifespan tripled. We built a better world. Yes, Lydia agreed. We did. But I sometimes think we forgot to ask what we might be building toward.